In Module 101, I talked about the fact that we can have default arguments for our functions. Now we can also specify default arguments for our constructors. Now this can be very useful. One constructor with default arguments can handle multiple cases, including the fact that it can act as the default constructor. This can reduce the number of constructors for the class. Recall that a default constructor does not expect any arguments. Now if default arguments are specified for all formal parameters of some constructor, then that constructor also qualifies as the default constructor. And that's because you can instantiate the class without providing arguments for object initialization. In other words, the default constructor does not expect any arguments in that case, because you've already provided default arguments in the definition. So here's a quick example again using the GameStats class. In the public section I have the constructor. Now in this case the constructor has default arguments. You can see GameStats, and then between parentheses I have int level p for parameter, and I assign that a default value of 1, a default argument of 1, and for the room formal parameter I set that to 1 by default as well. I have this helper function again, toString, and I'll scroll down to that, and of course that's simply going to print out the current level and the current room again. Okay, now here is the constructor. Of course I'm going to do this. You can do this in the body if you want, but in this case I do it in the initialization list. Again, as we discussed, we sort of want to get used to using the initialization list, right? So the level member, I set that to the level parameter, and the room member I set to the room parameter. So what's going to happen when we construct an object? Well, if you don't specify any arguments, then of course it's going to use the default arguments, in this case 1 and 1, for the level and the room parameters. But if you go and specify arguments, then those arguments will override the default arguments. Okay, I'll scroll down to main, and we have GameStats game, so instantiate GameStats, and I do game.toString, and it prints out 1 and 1 for level and room. Because this constructor has default arguments already, we don't need to specify any arguments. Therefore we can use the constructor as if it is a default constructor, or we can pass in 1 argument, or we can pass in 2 arguments. Okay, so let's go back. If you're unsure of what formal parameter will accept this argument, again you can press and hold Ctrl, Shift, and then tap spacebar. I'll just go up one, and you can see the header here, GameStats, int level p, and we can see that this has the default argument, and we actually see our comment as well. Now the argument that we specify here will now override the default argument for this first parameter. Build and run that. The level is now set to 3. Now some of the benefits again of these constructors that have default arguments is that I have this one constructor now. It can act as the default constructor, it can act as a constructor that accepts 1 argument, or it can act as a constructor that accepts 2 arguments. So instead of having 1 default constructor and 2 more overloaded constructors, I simply have 1. I would not recommend this for every class that you write, but in some instances it can be handy. Now one thing I would like to note is, I'll go and declare and define a default constructor right here. So you might be thinking it's fine to have a default constructor like this, and then we have another one with these default arguments. And maybe you think, okay, here I'll just use that default argument now. If I build and run, I'll actually get an error. GameStats, ambiguous call to overloaded function. The reason why it's ambiguous is because it doesn't know which constructor to use. Should it use this one, or should it use the constructor which has 2 default arguments? Because it can use either one of those. So just keep that in mind when you are using constructors with default arguments. And that is going to wrap up this lecture on default constructor arguments.